sharing my slides now. If you can't hear me or can't see anything, please let me know. My internet is a little bit unreliable today, but I hope we're going to be just fine. And hopefully we'll have time for questions at the end. I've got 45 minutes, is that correct?
You have up till 10 o'clock. At 10 o'clock comes our keynote. So,
right,
but
perfect.
We were telling everybody to shoot for 45, 50 minutes.
Okay, I will do just that. So thank you for the introduction. Welcome to my session about cloud development with Microsoft's APIs, PowerShell and PowerAutomate. Good. What's on the agenda for today? First of all, very briefly, who am I and what am I going to be talking about? And then we're going to go straight into the content. The first bit is a bit finding out what you need or what you need to have in order to do proper cloud development with the tools that I mentioned. So just covering the basics in terms of licensing. Then I'm just going to show you very briefly, and I'm known for my way too fast way of presenting, very briefly, different ways of interacting, I call it programmatically, with Microsoft 365. So that would be, we're going to begin with PowerAutomate, but we're going to move on to things like PowerShell as well. Two different APIs that I'm usually working with, which would be the MS Graph API and the SharePoint API. And if we have time, that's why I asked for the time at the beginning, also looking into some aspects of a project that included Azure and Python. And yeah, I will be showing some demos that are pre-recorded to make sure that the demo gods, in case they're not with me, are going to be very good with me today. Right, so first of all, who am I? My name is Fritsch-Weninger. And I'm a cloud solution expert and cloud developer at ACP IT Solutions in Vienna, Austria. So slightly different time zone here. It's 4 o'clock in the afternoon here right now. And I specialize particularly on PowerAutomate, Microsoft Graph, and PowerShell. These are the main three technologies that I work on a day-to-day basis with, but not exclusively, because of course, with Microsoft 365, you always have different things popping up that might be interesting. So it's not a finite list. And the other thing is that I also have a lot of other tasks, not just cloud development, which means that there might be other technologies involved from time to time as well. And yeah, just very briefly about myself, I've had more than 15 years of work experience in IT. And in my day-to-day job at the moment, what I focus mainly on is that I take on client requests, mostly internally. At the moment, I used to do it externally before that, for mostly automation projects, business logics, and admin projects. And the way that we go about this usually is that they approach me, because I'm the main person to approach about this in the company, before any rash decisions are being made or any purchasing decisions are being made on to whether a different tool could be accomplishing this. So it's a very privileged and cool position where I can just see if with the tools that we have, with the architecture that we have, we can solve things our own, or whether it's a better idea to invest into something else with a grant budget. Before we go into the actual content of the presentation, I just want to start with a very important disclaimer, and that is there is not this one way of interacting with Microsoft 365. I'm sure you've heard a lot of things already, and will be hearing more, and so you can have different APIs or different approaches. And there is not this one way that's the correct or the right one. The reason I'm saying this is if we look at the different preferences that you might have, you might be coming from a programming background, so you might be keen to solve everything with a real programming language, .NET, Java, whatever you might feel comfortable with. That's one way you can access all the resources in Microsoft 365, and that's absolutely fine if you have the capabilities and the time to do so. Then you might be from more of a bit of an admin background. You might have started with PowerShell and dabbled in different technologies here. So you might be approaching things from a scripting background or with a scripting sort of focus. And then you might be using slightly different tools to achieve the same thing. And then there's a third option. You might have started to look into PowerAutomate and saw that you could do a lot of things more from a low code perspective really, and then also try to achieve exactly the same goals no matter what your starting point would be. And I just want to say that all of these starting points are absolutely fine depending on what your goals and outcomes are. You might have some advantages or disadvantages to some of them, but we all share a common goal at the end. Other preferences, of course, might also include, and that's something you might be seeing today in my presentation, that you are someone who prefers to work from a GUI point of view, or you prefer SDKs or APIs raw, processed via programming language. Or if you're working with cloud services, you might be working with containers or proprietary services. So there is just a huge ton of ways out there that you can do the same thing. And for me personally, like I said at the beginning, cloud development is one of my main tasks, but not the only one. So I have little time, but a lot of demands from my customers and my clients. And that's why I prefer convenience. So my personal approach in the demos that you'll be seeing today is based around convenience. But like I said, there are always for each solution, probably 10, 20 or 30 other ways you could be doing this. Great, so let's go straight into the what do you need? I said at the beginning that in my current role, I'm looking at requirements from my customers, internal clients, to figure out if one of their automation or logic needs can be solved with our architecture. Now, if you want to do the same, obviously, then you would have to figure out first for your cloud development, what is your licensing situation. I'm not going to go into much detail into what the differences are between E1, E3, E5, A1, and so on and so forth. That's covered in different sections. But the main thing that you should be looking out for if you want to achieve the same goals is make sure you have some sort of basic Microsoft 365 license that will, in most cases, cover PowerAutomate with a lot of features that don't need extra licensing. So you should be good to go with that respect. When we get to PowerShell, actually, it's also something that you can do with a basic license. However, for that, you need to make sure that you have sufficient privileges for your PowerShell. Mainly, if you want to test things locally, I'm talking about admin privileges here so that you can install all the modules that you need. And of course, privileges on the tenant itself to make sure that the scripts that you're going to be running can actually access and modify the data that you're looking for. So this is less of a licensing issue than a privilege issue. And definitely recommended in that same sense is that you have admin privileges for your own test tenant. This is something that's incredibly crucial because a lot of the things that I'm doing on a day-to-day basis with the tools, I'm using things from the PowerShell gallery, which might not be things that are finished or just as stable as they could be. Or I might be playing around with Azure services where you might want to have a special subscription that doesn't cost anything, or you might be trying everything out in the beta version of Microsoft Graph API, where some things might disappear again. So for all these things, just to maximize everything that you could be doing in terms of prototyping and trying things out, it's absolutely crucial that you have a test tenant before you actually apply something to the live tenant. And covered with a basic license as well is your access to APIs. Mainly, I'll be talking today about Graph API and SharePoint API, and both of these APIs can be sort of sorted out or called with a basic licensing. Again, make sure that you have sufficient privileges in the test tenant to try out API calls before that. So in a nutshell, that means that if you want to do quite a lot in terms of finding solutions or coming up with good solutions for Microsoft 365 related problems, you can stretch it really far with the basic license. When would it be a good idea to invest into more, or what could you be looking at for if you wanted to do more? If you need, for instance, more governance, so for instance, you want to make sure that not just you can access a resource, but you want to be sharing your development with an external client, or you want to make sure that you have a more finer grading of permissions, these kind of things, then you have to up the ante. As well as if you're concerned with API limits, PowerAutomate, for instance, in its basic license gives you a decent number of API calls that you can call per user or per flow on a daily basis. However, if you create automation that runs once per second every day, then these limits might not be good enough for you. So this is where you might have to splash some cash. You might also want to look into specific AI features. That's particularly the case for PowerAutomate and Power Apps, which are shipped with wonderful, really nicely working AI features, but they just cost extra, and that's something that if you're interested in this, you would have to budget for. Also, if you're interested in things like having more storage for may it be database storage or any kind of blob storage, or more language independence, so you don't want to be working just with PowerAutomate, but you want to run something in your favorite programming language, or you want to be even more independent in terms of your framework. All of these might be factors where the basic license alone won't cut it anymore. And if you're running into these kind of problems, you will probably have to invest in an Azure subscription, which gives you solutions for all of the problems on the left-hand side. And if it's only specific things that you're looking for, such as API limits or governance or AI features, it might also be a better Microsoft 365 license. And there are also specific licenses for instance, for PowerAutomate, where you can get more features for a specific tool. So that's the very first thing to cover, to make sure that if you want to be able to do everything that I'm going to show you in a second, this is what you need. I'm just going to take a very short break and drink something. I'm so used to doing 30-minute presentations that I've got this incredible speed going on. I'm going to try and slow down a little bit. All right. The first thing I want to show you now is some information about PowerAutomate. I don't want to go into too much detail with this, but it's a very good starting point if cloud development in Microsoft 365 is something that's completely new to you. And I will keep the demo fairly short, but I might show you some more examples of the other things from within PowerAutomate as well, which is why it's crucial just to get yourself familiarized with this. In a nutshell, if you haven't seen PowerAutomate before, it's a low-code editor with a visual interface. So you can see it here on the right-hand side, that basically you're stacking different sequences of what you want the automation to run sequentially underneath each other. And you can do so pretty much indefinitely. So each of these little boxes is called an action. And PowerAutomate is basically shipped with 3 types of things that make it so powerful. The first one, which you can see in the screenshot, which is marked in pink, is what I call the classical elements of other programming languages that you'd find elsewhere as well. So PowerAutomate does come with things like loops, conditionals, and all these sorts of things that you would know from a normal programming language, and that gives you a lot of flexibility. But what makes PowerAutomate so special for Microsoft 365 is that it's also shipped with these yellow components, which are the Microsoft 365 components. So that means that PowerAutomate, with the basic license that you have, can already access pretty much everything that you can do in your Microsoft 365 tenant. So it could be, I'm going to show you in a minute anyway, but here this would be an example of PowerAutomate interacting with your Outlook. That's really important because that already should give you an indicator of how powerful this tool is. And just with the basic license and most things that you have in PowerAutomate that you don't have to pay for extra, you can probably already cover 60 or 65% of all the different things that you might be facing in terms of automation challenges. It's slightly more when we get to premium features, which we're going to look at in a minute as well. And the further we go today in our presentation, the more of a completion in terms of feature completion and also coverage of Microsoft 365 we'll get. But PowerAutomate is a very decent start. And then if that's not enough for you, if you need more, what you also get, and that's marked in turquoise here, is that you can also apply formulae to values and variables. So on top of the concept that you already have, you could be doing things like string concatenation, you could be replacing elements, you could be doing time zone formatting, all that kind of stuff. So there's a complete, rather large collection of out-of-the-box standard formulae that you can apply to your data that you're automating. Great. So one question I get asked a lot is how easy is it to build flows? Personally, I think when you have a bit of a learning curve at the beginning, when you've never done anything with PowerAutomate, where you just have to understand its basic usage, understand how it works, things you should do and shouldn't be doing. Also related to the fact that you can only work on this pretty much from within your web browser. So there's just a couple of things that you need to get your head around at the beginning. But once you've sorted that out, it's pretty safe and you're pretty good to go for basic things, mainly because PowerAutomate is shipped with a plethora of templates that cover pretty much any case for any collaboration problem that you might have in Microsoft 365. And the cool but dangerous thing with these templates is that you can simply click them, you can add them, and they are yours. And the only thing that you have to do is make them your own by replacing URLs and stuff and making them work for your situation. So if this is all that you're looking at, you can see that it's not the steepest of learning curves and that you can get quite good results already. But that's a bit of a danger because this is where many people usually stick, and then it gets really tricky when it comes to implementing custom solutions. That's when the learning curve seems to be never ending, simply because you can do a lot in PowerAutomate, but then it's a lot about already having programming experience, because only then you can apply the programming principles really well. And of course, extending the functionality with the tools that I'm going to be showing you today. So if you get to that stage, this would be more what I call probably a low-code developer. So moving away from just trying things or automating here and there, but to be actually a developer at this point. So is it easy to build flows? It depends on what you want to do. But the more complex your requirements are, the more difficult it gets to build them with PowerAutomate. Right. So I want to show you my first little demo just to give you some idea of what this looks like. So this is from my test tenant. You can see here that's a typical setup of PowerAutomate, where you have all these sequential steps, one after the other. And the thing that I want to show you now is the different actions that you get in PowerAutomate, which just to help you understand what you can do. So you can see these control features here. These would be what I referred to before, where you have some aspects that you'd get in a programming language as well. So for instance, here we have if, the condition, a for each loop, a while loop. The scope connector, for instance, would be to replicate try catch that you might know from other programming languages. So all of this is shipped with the basic license, and you can use it straight from within PowerAutomate without any extra cost. Then, of course, the really interesting thing is the built-in functions as well, which is on top of the control functions that you have. There might be things that you have to do with, for instance, data operation would be a good example, where you might be just want to be producing output, or as you can see further down below, you might want to parse JSON data. So all of this already comes with PowerAutomate. And I just want to mention that these are really cool features because just like pretty much everything in Microsoft 365, PowerAutomate also is a RESTful API underneath its hood, and that means that this REST API has JSON as its main format for exchange. So PowerAutomate comes with a lot of JSON output that you can make use of if you know how to access it, but it also comes with features that can parse all that output for you. So it's pretty powerful, especially if you work with JSON data. And of course, in here you also have other things like, number functions that you might be using, text functions or variables. And again, here, everything you would want from a programming language mostly. So you'd have arrays, strings, and of course, counting, setting variables and things like that. And the really interesting thing now is the standard functionality. So if you expand this and you look at this, and we're just going to pause at any point here, you can see here that the standard functionality, that's a bit of a mixed bag in the sense of that some of this is free and some isn't. It really just depends on what you want to do. We're going to cover the free ones, the Microsoft 365 connectors in a second, but what's important here is that you can see that not all of this here is from the Microsoft realm. So we can look at PagerDuty over here, or Basecamp 2, or Adobe Sign. So you can see that within that, what they call the standard portfolio, you have things that are non-Microsoft, and including these connectors from a PowerAutomate side, of course, is free. So there's nothing you have to do in here in terms of payment for this. But of course, if we have a product such as, let's take Jira, for example, there is a free connector for Jira, so you can work with Jira automation from within PowerAutomate. It doesn't have to be in the Microsoft 365 realm, but of course, that requires you to have the licensing for Jira on the other side. So the cost would be outsourced, not in this tenant, but with the product that you want to be using. And in a second, what I want to show you, usually what I do is we have, most projects, we have a rather strict setup in terms of what we want to use or could use. So I'm trying to stay within the Microsoft 365 realm. And just to give you an idea what you could be doing with Microsoft 365, the best way to do this is to go to office.com and just look at the different apps that you have available. And then you can see that for most of these, you would find an equivalent in PowerAutomate. So if we look at this list, for instance, and we'd see that, for instance, for Outlook, if we looked in PowerAutomate and we'd look for Outlook, we'd see that we'd have different connectors for that. Or for Microsoft Planner, this is also from Microsoft, you would have a set of connectors. And of course, also for Teams. So if you look into these, you can already see that these standard connectors cover pretty much everything that you want from Microsoft 365 and has a lot of different functionalities. So for instance, for Teams, posting messages or creating channels, everything you would expect at this point. Cool. And then just one more thing to remember then, the so-called premium connectors. An example for this would be that premium means that this is not covered by the basic license. And that means that you would have to get, for instance, a PowerAutomate per plan, per user license or something on top, or it could be also AI features. And these are usually, I tend to say, those connectors that make your PowerAutomate automations a little less technology agnostic, because, for instance, if you look here at the example of the HTTP connector, that allows you to access anything via HTTP from our PowerAutomate, which of course gives you a lot more power than just staying with within your tenant. Other connectors that also are premium would include, as I've mentioned before, AI features, for instance, are also come at a premium, and anything that you would want to do when you want to connect towards the world of Azure, which I'm going to cover a little bit later. Cool. So that would be PowerAutomate, the basic capabilities in a nutshell. And I want to take it straight to the next content unit, and I want to show you an example of what you can do with this now. And next, I would like to cover the SharePoint API. Like I already said with PowerAutomate, this is also a RESTful service via HTTP and also via JSON. And if you want to find the documentation, that's quite a good starting point. This would be the link here. Why would you want to use the SharePoint API? I said just a second ago that PowerAutomate, for instance, comes with most connectors already out of the box, usable from within PowerAutomate. That same thing applies to SharePoint. However, I said at the beginning that with the basics that you have in PowerAutomate, you can only cover roughly 60% of all the things that might be thrown at you. And SharePoint is a very good example for the reason that SharePoint as a technology has been existing for much longer than some of the things in Microsoft 365. So you have a lot of legacy services that are somehow semi-transferred into the cloud world, but that still are not fully explored by modern capabilities. That's one thing to remember. And the other thing to remember is that these connectors, for instance, in PowerAutomate, they give you something that you can use. So for instance, if you want to create a SharePoint site, that would be available as a standard connector in PowerAutomate. But there might be a lot of cases for very specific things that don't exist as a PowerAutomate connector. An example for this would be something that all of you who work with SharePoint a lot might see a lot, which is breaking inheritance. So that means that I don't want to go into SharePoint, I'm not a SharePoint expert, but basically breaking up the permissions that are hierarchical in a SharePoint site and doing something else with them. And that's something that, for instance, doesn't work easily or out of the box with standard connectors, and this is where the SharePoint API comes in. So for any specific scenarios where you have to do something really specific, really custom, or really dynamic, this is where the SharePoint API would come in. I don't want to be too negative. I'm trying to phrase this diplomatically. If you've been working a lot with cloud development in Microsoft 365, you might find that depending on what you want to work with, the documentation is not always as complete as you would want to wish. I think SharePoint API is one of the better examples where, as you can see my screenshot here on the left, it's giving you a lot of information how the REST service works and giving you a lot of examples as well. So my tip would be, if you have never worked with SharePoint API, just walk through the documentation because for a change, this is really quite good. And just as with all other Microsoft 365 development projects, for anything that you don't find in the documentation, there is at least a 70% chance that somebody on the internet will have shared this and will have worked on this problem before. But of course, the newer the functionality and the more up-to-date the service that you're using, the less likely is that you're going to find anything. Let's have a quick look at SharePoint API together, again from a PowerAutomate perspective, simply because, and I will show you why, it's a good starting point. So if we look at one of my flows here, you can see that I already put together several activities in this flow. It's a flow that's triggered manually, and I just want to show you this is how you find the SharePoint API connector in PowerAutomate. So you look for HTTP request, and then in SharePoint you'll find it here. It says send an HTTP request to SharePoint. And basically what you always need for this connector is you need the site address. So obviously it's communicating with SharePoint, and that means that it needs to know which site it goes to. One of the advantages of using PowerAutomate here is that you get an Ajax site picker here. That means that you don't need to know the URLs by heart, and you also see only those SharePoint sites that you have permission to access, so that's quite convenient. Then since this is an HTTP request, it means that we get all the HTTP activities that we would want to see here. So of course, get, post, put, and all these kinds of things are possible. Usually the most likely is that you will either use get or post in your automation. Then that's the part that's usually not that well documented, and that's what you have to figure out is the actual URI that you need to send with your HTTP request. So since this is a REST API, you get the endpoints in that URI format, and that's exactly where the magic happens. We'll see a couple of examples. And of course, headers, if you had to add something specific, although as we'll see in a minute, PowerAutomate takes a lot care of a lot of things magically in the background, so you don't have to worry about headers too much. And of course, the body. And here there's a reminder again directly from within Microsoft 365, enter request content in JSON. So it's already giving you a hint as to where this goes. But the nice thing is that you can also send other payloads, or HTML payload, for instance. Right, we're going to remove that again. Breathe for a second. How am I doing timing wise? Oh, not great. All right. I just wanted to show you some sample requests for SharePoint API. The first one would be a get request for getting list items from a specific SharePoint list. So you can see here that my API, my URI includes get by title on the endpoint lists. And here I'm supplying the name of that SharePoint list that I want to get the items from. So that would be exactly this page here. So you can see here, this is the tenant, the site up here, and this is ASDAS, is that wonderful list that I want to be working with. And of course, the final endpoint would be items to get the items. In the same fashion, for the same list again, it would be exactly the same endpoint. So the same as getting list items would be adding list items. But just notice that the difference here would be it's not a get request, but this is post request. So we're posting something towards the endpoint. And here then we also include the JSON payload, because what we want to do is we want to add an item to an existing list. So here we're going to add content to the title column that exists, which is this one, and then a number, which you saw here, is the other one. Please note that's just a side note, and that's also a SharePoint thing, is that if you have a SharePoint list, the names of the columns are hardwired in the background, so they never change, even if you can change the names later on. So that means that if you have a column that you call something else at a later point, it will always retain the same internal name. And if you supply any seemingly invalid characters with a column name, such as I did previously with this column, what SharePoint does is it's trying to replace umlauts and any special characters by this very specific naming convention here. So even though you can't see it, when you look at the JSON output, you would see that this is the corresponding column. Great. And then what else do we have here? This would be just be getting the site users on the SharePoint site. That's hidden somewhere on the SharePoint site. If you wanted to look at it from a GUI point of view, you could be looking at the SharePoint users from here on the GUI. That's exactly what this API request does. You could be also getting specific users, so not just all of them, but a specific one. So if you compare the previous request to the endpoint site users, here it's the same endpoint. But what we're doing is we're adding an OData filter request, which means that we want to limit the responses that we're getting back, and we just want to filter for one specific email address from that entire data set that you're getting back from this endpoint. And of course, you could be doing things like creating a file in the SharePoint library. So if we look at this page, for example, that would be exactly in this document library here, the shared documents. a post request. And what we do here is, if you look at the URL, is we're getting the URL of that specific library that we want. So here I'm having a relative path to that exact library. The URL for this you can take straight away from your browser, from URL, because it's nicely URL encoded. So it would be this part up here. Yes, go on. And then the endpoint would be in files. And adding a file would be that you add the keyword add at the end with the URL, and that specifies what the name of the file will be and whether you want to overwrite a file if an existing file with the same name already exists. And the cool thing here that you can see, because it's a post request, again, we need a body, a payload to send towards the endpoint. You can see that in here we've got some HTML. So it doesn't necessarily have to be JSON. That's another advantage of using PowerAutomate or something else. In normal programming or scripting language, you would have to take care of this yourself, and you would have to specify in the header if this is a JSON content or HTML content or something else. And PowerAutomate, with its magic, will just assume and look at this and say it's not JSON, it's HTML, and will magically do this for us. And we'll write exactly this HTML content into the file that we're creating in this library here. Great. Yeah, like I said, HTML. Hurry up myself. This is getting all site groups. These would be the intricate groups that SharePoint is shipped with when you create a SharePoint site, plus the custom ones. And now if we test this and we run this flow, we can see exactly what's happening. So let's look at just some of them. For instance, get list items would supply us with all these items that are on this specific list. And if you look at the JSON output from that flow here, so this is what all the output in a flow usually looks like. There was a item on that list which was called test. So it had test in the title. So we can see here if that's a match with our list. And it had ID 1, and that's exactly this one, ID 1 and test, so that works. Another thing would be adding something to the list. We created something that was called automatically created another item with a huge number. So you can see that's down here. So that has also worked. And what else do we have? For instance, getting all the SharePoint. Oh, I'm checking another one. That's the last one. Okay, cool. That's the new one. Getting all the SharePoint site users. So I know for a fact that I'm on that list because I'm able to edit that SharePoint list. And so you can see here, I'm listed among the SharePoint site users as well. And maybe looking lastly at creating a SharePoint file in the library. Has that worked? We need to look for this specific HTML file, and it was here again. Right, about a minute ago, that's about right. And you can see here very nicely the file has been created, and the HTML content that we created has been interpreted as such, and you now have a working HTML file in here. So these are just some of the things that you could be doing with the SharePoint API from within PowerAutomate. The next thing I want to talk about would be PowerShell and Microsoft 365. PowerShell, of course, for those of you who are not new to Microsoft 365, is a scripting language that's much older than Microsoft 365. It actually has its origins in Microsoft Server maintenance and also in Microsoft, what's the word that I'm looking for? Device management. So you could be running this on your local machine as well as on servers. And of course, with the rise of Microsoft 365, PowerShell also gained some capabilities in terms of dealing with Microsoft 365 as well. And these are, as you can see here on the left-hand side, specifically Microsoft 365 commandlets. So what you have to do in order to use them is you have to install these modules that come with these commandlets on your machine. That means that if you run this locally, you would need admin permissions for your computer to run it locally on your computer. Or if you work, for instance, in a cloud environment on Azure, then you would have to install these modules in the cloud environment to make sure that you can use them. The important thing to remember about the Microsoft 365 PowerShell commandlets is that these have, let's say, historical value in the sense of in PowerAutomate, you only ever see the most recent version of everything. So you can't run into any version conflicts unless there is a bad merge. That's really convenient. But of course, since PowerShell has been existing for much longer, it needs to cater for legacy projects as well and legacy code as well. And that's why you might find that for the same feature, you might have 2 or 3 different modules that seem to be covering the same thing. And that's just something to really look out for. And this is particularly dangerous if you're working with, again, SharePoint would be an example where you might see very different modules, and some of these are already outdated. Or, which is also the case with Microsoft Teams, for instance, because Teams used to be or has replaced Skype for Business. So a lot of features have been dealt with in PowerShell with the Skype for Business PowerShell modules instead of a Teams one. So again, you have to be really careful in terms of legacy code here and making sure that you're developing with PowerShell with the latest commandlets only. That's a bit of a balancing act to get right. If you've never worked with PowerShell before, here is a link. You can take a screenshot to a very, very basic overview, introduction, bit of a marketing text, if you will, to PowerShell. Sadly, it's in German, so I hope that you're fluent. But if you are, it's a good starting point if you've never done anything with PowerShell in your life. So make sure you make a note of this. With PowerShell, I don't want to go into much detail because we'd need several days to cover PowerShell, but what I wanted to show you instead is just an example of how you could be using your normal PowerShell skills and adding Microsoft 365 capability to it. So here we have a PowerShell script. It's in the middle of that script. It's quite a long script, actually. And what this particular script does is it's adding new users to your Microsoft 365 tenant from a CSV list. And that's a typical example for something where you might want to use PowerShell because handling CSV files in PowerShell can be done in 2 lines. And these users that you're getting from the CSV list are added to the tenant. If there are users that are not valid anymore, these are replaced. And the script also gives these users custom permissions and sends them custom mails. And this is where the Microsoft 365 connectors come in. So here, for example, what I'm doing here is I'm converting, that's still normal PowerShell, if you will. I'm getting the email address for a user from that CSV list, and I'm replacing some of the bits and pieces in that email address by what you can see here, that bit which says ext for external, because these are guest users, and putting together what the user principal name looks like in the tenant to make sure that I can then, once I've established the connection to Microsoft 365, I can look for these users. And that's exactly what is the case in the next line. So here we have an example of get Azure AD user. This is one of the commandlets from the Microsoft 365 PowerShell modules. And what this does is I'm getting, with that user principal name that I created up here, I'm getting a specific user and I'm checking if that user already exists in the tenant. And if it does, then I'm skipping that user. If that user doesn't exist, then I'm doing something else. That's another Microsoft 365 commandlet, which is new Azure ADMS invitation. And what this does is it's quite a cool thing that does many things at once. What it does is it's sending a new email, or maybe the first step is it's adding a user to a tenant. So this could be a guest user or a normal tenant, a normal user. And at the same time, it's also sending, you might have seen this before when you've been invited to a tenant, it's sending that welcome message to the new user. And in this part of the script, you can see here that the message that you're sending to that user in PowerShell with this commandlet can be changed and can be customized to what you need it to be. So for instance, here I'm adding the user's first and last name that I've got from the CSV file, adding some links to a start page and so on and so forth. And the very cool thing is this is, for instance, an example of something that is more powerful in PowerShell than PowerAutomate. If for some reason, like I did here, you just want to add the user, but you want to suppress the standard invitation at a later point, that's something you cannot do in PowerAutomate, but you can do it in PowerShell simply with setting a specific flag to no. And that, of course, gives you more power to replace the standard welcome mail with a custom welcome email. So that was PowerShell in a very, very quick roundup. I'm looking at the time now. I'm terrible with the time. I'm very sorry. We might not get to the end. So if there are any questions, it would be lovely if you could interrupt me and say, look, we have 3 questions before I use the entire time up. All right, gathering more breath. The next thing I want to talk about is Microsoft Graph API. My example, if we get to this, will again be from within PowerAutomate. But Graph API is one example which is perfect as a technology agnostic thing. So you can see here in that screenshot that there is a very nice SDK available for PowerShell, which is maintained quite a lot and which has good examples in it that you can use if you work from within PowerShell. And of course, you can see here that a lot of different platforms and programming languages are supported here as well. So you're not restricted to one specific one. The best way to show what Graph API does and what it's capable of is to show you a very quick demo again. Let me just close this one. The best starting point for anyone to work with Microsoft Graph API is through the Graph Explorer. If you're used to REST APIs, you might be familiar with Postman, which would be comparable. Graph Explorer, of course, is something that runs in the browser only, and it has a couple of nice features. And the first thing you can see here on the left is, oops, what's with my video? That looks dead. Sorry, let me try that again. Are you going to be good? Yes, looks like it. The first thing you can see here on the left-hand side is that you can log in with your user, and that will give you automatically all the permissions that your current user has, and will only let you run queries if you have the responding permissions. So a word of warning, if you don't have advanced privileges on your tenant, you won't be able to see a lot in here, and it makes more sense with your test tenant to get that kind of information from here. And you can see here conveniently, again, as we had in PowerAutomate before, you have a couple of different requests that you can send, get requests, so on and so forth. What's automatically set up is the V1, which means that we're still in version 1.0 in Graph API, which is a good thing because, of course, that means that if you have anything legacy, you don't really have anything because you don't have any much older pre-existing versions for this. There is a beta version, however, which some of the features that people are missing are part of that beta version. So that's great if you find a solution for that, but of course, you will have to wait until this will be merged into a stable version. And similar to what we had before with the SharePoint API, again, we have the URI here at the end with the specific endpoints that are defined. Slightly different to what we had in SharePoint is that the URI always starts with graph.microsoft.com. And then in here, careful, if you're working with the beta, the V1 would be replaced with beta, obviously. That very first predefined request that you can see here, which is the me endpoint, is something that any user can run. So even if you don't have admin privileges, you would see if it's green, okay, HTTP 200 response. You can see that this is getting your information on your profile. And you can see again, as with all the APIs so far, we've seen that the information is JSON format. So you can see it here in the response. What else could you be doing with Graph API? And maybe before I show you, just a very important thing to say. I said at the beginning that PowerAutomate can cover a lot. Graph API can cover almost everything that you want to do in the Microsoft 365 realm. And there might be even cases where the documentation says, do you want to enable or disable a specific admin functionality? That's only possible with Graph API. So an example for this would be if you had, for instance, Active Directory connected in a hybrid setting where you want to gather specific fields that are only that are synced from Active Directory to Azure Active Directory. That's a super specific case where Graph API would come in and would give you all that information that you need. But of course, above that would be PowerShell, simply because PowerShell comes with all these different both up-to-date and legacy modules that you have and can also work with Graph API. And on top of that, I would see anything where you can combine all of these features with Azure. Cool, but let's look at Graph API, what we can do with it. And the nice thing about the Graph Explorer is that you can try some queries in here. So you can see if we look for groups, for instance, let's try this one. Get all groups in my organization. This would also update the URI that you see up here exactly. And since this is a RESTful API that is based in Microsoft, again, we can add these OData filters that we saw before. So here at the end of my URI, I'm adding the $select. That would be one of the options that you could do. And this would filter my response to show not all of these different properties that you see here, but to just show me the display name. So if we run this again, we'd see that then the response is filtered down to just the display name. And one other example would be for Microsoft Teams. Again, this would be something you don't need many privileges for. This would be getting me all the teams that I'm a part of that I've joined. So you can see here. Now, very briefly, what can we do with this? Like I said, we don't have time for this, unfortunately, today. Of course, you can incorporate Graph API in PowerShell. You can run it very nicely from within Azure, but for the sake of today's example, let's show it from PowerAutomate. And the really cool thing about PowerAutomate here that I like in particular is if you go into Data, Custom Connectors, you can, even with the basic license, you can create, I think it's one free connector that you can add here. And this connector, for instance, would be a Graph API connector. So you can see here in that field here, on this left-hand side, these are all actions that I've defined, and each of them represents one API request for Graph API. And the cool thing is, once you've set this up, I mean, of course, you have permissions and things to set up with this, so it's not a thing you can't do this without admin privileges, of course. But once this is set up and you've got the scope defined for what you want to do, you can basically create one action per API request. So for instance, if we're going to say get all groups, what you need to do is you can then put in the URL, the endpoint for that request that you want to do. And very nicely, you can see here, there is the option for import from sample. So what you could be doing is you could be just trying things out with the Graph Explorer first, copying the output that you get here, and then import this to your custom connector. And of course, like I showed before, here there is a select query that you can add to this query. but you could be adding filtering or max min things and so on. And also conveniently here in the response field, you can add a sample response of what the API will return as a response, which makes it much easier for PowerAutomate to then say, okay, what do you actually want to see in PowerAutomate when you run this request? If you leave it on by default, it means that it's going to give you everything that the HTTP request would deliver you, but you could also customize this to match your expectations. And then how do you use this? Well, if you go into a flow and you've set it up correctly with authentication and permissions, then you would go here into custom. And this is where the custom connector would pop up. So here we have all my different, you can see here, each of the API requests that I have created in the custom connector are now listed as one connector in PowerAutomate. Let's get the groups one that I had, and you can see here that I've got the select parameter in here. The cool thing is that it's interpreted dynamically, which means it doesn't put in the sample content that you put in when setting up. So you can put in anything here. If you wanted to select per user a group ID, for instance, or if you wanted to select by group location, that's what you could do. Or in this example, what we're going to do is we're going to select by display name again. And just to show you what we have if we ran this, what could we use in terms of output? You can then see here that already you would get all these dynamically created properties. And each of these represents what we saw in the Graph Explorer before as one of the properties. So that's the really cool thing. If you ran that request and all you wanted to see was mail, then you could just work with mail as that dynamical value. Right, and let's just briefly run this to see, to prove that this is going to be exactly what we needed. So this is what we got before. I'm going back and forth here. Oh, my time is so bad. I'm so sorry. Oh, I'm running out of time. Okay, we ran this, and now you can see in the responses, you can see that the output is exactly the same as we had previously in the Graph Explorer. Now, unfortunately, my time is up. The last thing I still wanted to show you was Azure things. Maybe you can write to me on LinkedIn to find out more about this. It's really cool. Basically, what I wanted to show you is the combination of PowerAutomate with Azure Runbooks, which is one of the ways where you can run PowerShell code in the cloud. There are better ways of doing this, such as Azure Functions, for instance, but because Azure Runbooks are a little bit slower. But what I really like about them is that you have around, I think, not sure, but I think around 500 runs per month that are free on the Runbooks. And free is always good. So for testing purposes, I highly recommend using Azure Runbooks. And the cool thing is I had something implemented where I had a script in Python that would only run properly in Python because that had the libraries that I needed. And this shows you that with Azure, for instance, you can then put everything together. You can run some things that come from PowerAutomate. You can then run some PowerShell code in the cloud that is only triggered if you need it. And then you can run some Python as well, and all of them combined in one tool. So that's really cool. So unfortunately, my time is up. I can show you next time. Thank you for attending my session. If you still have a question, I think we have 1 minute. And feel free to contact me on LinkedIn. Here's my email address and my LinkedIn. And well, at least I made it on time.